Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to give everybody another minute or two to log on before we get started. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you out West. Thanks for taking the time to join us for today's webinar titled Communicating with Congress, a Hill Staffer's Perspective. My name is Leah Jakubowicz, and I'm the marketing manager here at Phone to Action. Before we get started, I'd like to walk through a few quick housekeeping items. You have two choices for how to listen to today's event: over your computer speakers or by dialing in over the phone. If you run into problems with your computer's audio, go ahead and dial into the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel. Next, we are recording this event, and we will be sending a link to all registrants after the event has concluded. Finally, don't hesitate to put your questions into the chat box in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. Now, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Martin.
Thank you very much, Leah. Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Griffin with Phone to Action. I'm on the customer success team here today, and I am joined today by our guest, Sergio Espinosa, Legislative Director for Congressman Gene Green in the U.S. House of Representatives. Sergio, how are you doing today?
Martin, thank you. I'm doing excellent, and I just want to thank you and Angela and for having me on today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're excited to have you on, and we're looking forward to this conversation today. So, Sergio, and a little bit of background, Sergio and I know each other from my time on the Hill, and we're going to get into that. But the flow of our conversation today will be as follows. We will have a discussion for about 35 to 40 minutes. I'm going to ask Sergio a few questions. We'll let him talk a little about his background. And then after our conversation, we're going to open it up to some questions from our listeners here today. Okay? Sergio, you ready?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'm going to start with some background about myself for those who may not be familiar. My name is, again, Martin Griffin on the customer success team at Phone to Action. And prior to joining Phone to Action, I actually used to work on Capitol Hill, which is where I first met Sergio. So I used to work as a legislative staffer for former Congressman Dick Snyder, who's since retired, first serving as his legislative correspondent and eventually as his legislative assistant for the Veteran Affairs Committee. And we'll get back to what some of those titles mean later in our conversation. But I would like to now turn over to Sergio. Sergio, tell us a little about yourself, what you do on the Hill for Congressman Green.
Well, Martin, thank you again for having me on. As you had noted earlier, I am the Legislative Director for Congressman Gene Green. He represents the 29th District of Texas, which is in Houston and Harris County, Texas. As a legislative director, I'm sorry?
No, please continue. I was saying,
okay. All right. As a legislative director, it does vary a little bit from office to office, but essentially you are the main staffer dealing with policy issues before a congressional office. That typically involves staffing a member for committee hearings, either writing or helping to write potential legislation or amendments to legislation that the House will be considering. It also includes typically being the primary contact for either leadership offices or the committee or committees that the member is on, or outside stakeholder groups that want to build relations or have relations with that elected official. In addition to my office, terrific.
Excellent, thank you. And how long have you worked on Capitol Hill?
I've been on Capitol for 9.5 years. The past 7.5. I've been here for a bit. Yes. Yeah. I first started when President Bush was in office.
Okay. President George W. Bush, not H.W. Bush.
That is correct.
Excellent. And tell us about some of the positions and roles you have served while being a staffer on Capitol Hill. You're currently a legislative director, but walk us through the different roles that you've held and sort of describe briefly what those positions did, just to give our listeners a sense of where you're coming from and your personal background in a congressional office.
That's no problem. So the first position I held was a staff assistant. That was my first job here. At that time, I was working for a member named Congressman Javier Becerra, who's now the Attorney General of the state of California. And a staff assistant is the lowest paid position typically in a House or Senate office. And they're basically the first person you meet when you walk into a congressional office. They're the ones who answer the phones. They typically are the ones who open the mail. They're the ones who'll give tours to the Capitol. They're really like a jack of all trades, if you will. But it's a very good way to learn about a congressional office, what a congressional office deals with. After that, I was a legislative correspondent for a year, and they're the primary individual who deals with collecting and responding to constituent inquiries. After that, I was a legislative assistant for several years, and a legislative assistant typically is typically assigned a certain number of policy issues, and you follow those. And so when a bill comes up on the floor, you give the member a recommendation saying, we like this, we don't like this, these are the reasons why. Many legislative assistants also have committee work, depending on the committees that the member is on. They can also assist with correspondence. They can assist with communicating with outside stakeholders. I would say those are the primary functions of a legislative assistant. A legislative director has similar duties, but typically monitoring and supervising what's going on. And typically they're the primary contact for things like leadership offices, committee offices, and typically because they've been with a member for several years, they have their own relationships with stakeholders, either be from community activists, private interests, and the like.
Okay, great, thank you. And to our listeners, I wanted Sergio to explain that, to give you some context as to why we invited him on to speak, because he is, again, a senior staffer for a senior member of Congress. I believe Congressman Green has been in office for over 20 years now, so he would be considered a senior member of the House of Representatives. So you can hear not only a Hill staffer's perspective, but the perspective from a senior Hill staffer on the importance of correspondence, whether via email, whether it be via phone calls or social media, which is what we're going to get into. And very briefly, Sergio, you mentioned that both legislative assistants and you as a legislative director sometimes will have a policy portfolio. Can you share with us 2 or 3 broad policy issues that you cover as legislative director for Congressman Green?
Sure. 3 areas that I've worked on for many years for Congressman Green are immigration policy, environment policy, and telecommunications policy.
Okay, great. And I know with particularly environment and telecommunications policy, those tend to fall under the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and immigration policy tends to fall under the House Committee on the Judiciary, correct?
That is correct.
Excellent.
Excellent. And Congressman Green is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and so I have the pleasure, the honor of being able to staff him when there are issues dealing with telecommunications or the environment before the committee.
Okay, excellent, great. So, first question related to our discussion today. You're a senior staffer for a senior member of Congress. How important is constituent correspondence to your office?
For Congressman Green, it is a very big. It's a major priority for him. We provide him a weekly report on the progress of our mail correspondence. He puts a lot of emphasis on making sure that we respond to constituents timely and that they're appropriate, they're accurate, because issues change, bills get passed, and so he puts a lot of emphasis. He reads every letter that's sent out from his office. He reads, so it's a major importance to him.
I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Every letter that your office sends in a reply to constituent correspondence, the congressman reads.
Yes.
Okay. That's good to hear. It reminds me of how Congressman Snyder used to operate. Nothing came across or nothing left his office without him reviewing it. And with the case of physical mail or physical responses, I know Congressman Snyder would manually sign each letter. And that can vary from office to office, but that was one of the things I remembered as a legislative correspondent and legislative assistant. Now, Sergio, go ahead.
No, I'm ready.
Okay. So Hill offices receive a variety of correspondence, right? They receive physical mail in the form of letters and postcards. They receive faxes, emails, phone calls, and increasingly, we see constituents communicating with their elected officials via social media like Facebook and Twitter. As a staffer, which types of correspondence seem to resonate the most with you and your colleagues? And then by extension, what have you noticed has been resonating the most with Congressman Green?
Well, I would say we would have to put this into 2 different buckets. Because there's correspondence which may be specific to one individual in the district, what their needs are, and we try to be very responsive to those needs. It could just be someone saying, I didn't get my Social Security check, or I can't, renew my passport. Can you please help me? And we call that casework. Or they could have a request that's asking, like, there's some small thing that needs a congressional fix, or can you petition a federal agency on our behalf? And we'll do that. But the other bucket is for broader policy issues. And for that, Congressman Green tends to treat all forms of communication pretty equally. I'll be honest. It really depends, I would say, on how much is received. And if we can identify where the source of it is, like we can identify a certain correspondence campaign, and sometimes we can identify this is supporting X, or we believe Y group is supporting that. I guess it's a bit of a calculation, so this is where they're coming from. But if we believe that something is organic, or there's a need within the district, maybe something's just in the local news in Houston, and we start getting calls about it, like the congressman's going to be very, very responsive to that and say, we need a response somehow. We need to do something about this.
Right. Okay. Now you mentioned, sort of like these policy campaigns, and that is a space that Phone to Action works in, and that is a space that a lot of our partners who are listening in on this call and conversation operating as well. How does your office sort of handle and process and reply to correspondence? In this case, let's keep it to emails, phone calls, and social media that you all notice comes from a campaign. And I asked that question to our listeners. After we discuss this question, Sergio and I are going to take a look at 2 examples of actual correspondence that his office has received. We have removed any kind of identifying information from the constituent, but after Sergio answers this question, we're going to take a look at 2 examples of constituent correspondence. So Sergio, to reiterate, how does your office process and receive and reply to campaign correspondence that comes via emails, phone calls, and social media?
Well, normally what would happen is that we would identify, if we start receiving very similar letters, the same letters from multiple constituents, we would identify that issue area and we would write a response towards it. If it's an issue that we're familiar with, say if it's something that has had a lot of political attention, say like something to deal with the Affordable Care Act, we have a long library of existing letters that we could pull from to respond, or if it's something new about that issue, we would craft a new response that the congressman would authorize. But if it's a newer issue and we received a large number, say 30, 40, 50 letters, like we would bring it to the congressman's attention and say, we've received a great deal of emails or letters regarding this issue that hasn't had this kind of attention previously. I think that's something that for a lot of congressional offices that would catch our attention, things that might not necessarily be like politically like very that are very I guess like partisan or I guess you would say like politically driven.
Right.
The things that I would say like those are the things that would really catch our attention. And I think the Congress may be more interested in trying to find a way to find a solution, if it, at the very least, like be sympathetic to what that message is coming from those constituents, and at most, like try to find a solution to the issues that they're bringing up.
Okay, excellent. And before we get into the 2 sample emails, I want to ask a related question. We both mentioned letters, but how does your office handle increased amount of phone calls? Again, I used to work as a legislative correspondent, so one of my roles was that first person who answered the phone anytime anybody called the office. And a lot of times there would be days when there would be higher periods of activity, and there sometimes would be weeks of higher periods of activity. What is your office's approach to receiving that type of volume? And how does that type of volume attract the attention of Congressman Green?
So in my time in Congress, I've always had the feeling, and I think this is really coming from the electeds, that it's the responsibility of every staffer to be able to interact with constituents, take phone calls. So I do this to this very day if we're receiving a large volume of phone calls. The congressman wants to have a response for every constituent that calls in. So when every constituent that calls in, we ask for their name, their address, and what their concern is, and we will give them a written response. And for those that seem noteworthy, the congressman personally calls them back and just has a conversation as to what can we do to help them or try to help explain a policy area.
Really? So the congressman will actually personally call back some of the constituents that have called into the office?
Absolutely. He does this, I would several times a month, typically once or twice a week.
Okay.
and he's more likely to do with phone calls with people who, they just need some sort of help, they need some sort of fix, and he'll call them and he'll say, we're here to help and we'll try to help you as best we can. I know he's not the only member who does this. I know there are definitely other offices where the members really want to have that personal touch with constituents. They really take their job as being the federal representative of that district very, very close to their heart.
Okay, that's good to hear. Well, let's take a look at a couple of examples of emails that you have received or that your office has received. And again, we've removed identifying information from these emails and are just going to be showing the body. So this is a sample constituent email. It doesn't reference a particular bill, but we see that it refers to science, technology, communications. I'm going to read the email for those who might be listening in via their phone audio. And it says, "Dear Representative Green, I rely on my local radio for critical news, weather, sports, and information. It's my connection to the community. Please stand up for local broadcast radio listeners and television viewers like me, and don't do anything that would hurt my ability to access my local radio stations. Regards," and then it'll have the constituent's name. So, Sergio, this was an email that that stood out to you. Tell us a little about this email and why it resonated with you.
Well, for personal reasons, directed Congressman Green, this has to deal, as you said, with telecommunications, and he is on the House committee that has jurisdiction over federal telecommunications policy. So this is dealing with an issue that we're familiar with, relating to the status of radio and television broadcasts and the ease of access for American listeners and American viewers. And so that's how we responded with the letter, just responding, that Congressman Green has historically been very supportive of, of American listeners, American viewers have access to broadcast, radio, broadcast, television, and, doing our best to ensure that Americans continue to have access to that service free of charge.
Excellent. Go ahead.
And so there are also bills that we know either before the Energy and Commerce Committee or before other committees that we know are related to this letter. And so we reference some of that legislation that sort of touch on this letter.
Okay, great. What, in your opinion, are parts about this letter that make it an effective constituent email? I have my own opinions upon reading it, but what are some things that stand out to you as a staffer that really, draws you to this email?
Well, I'd say for me, as just sort of alluding to something I'd said previously, broadcast, like federal policy before broadcast, like broadcasting, it's not really a partisan issue. So it becomes I feel like it becomes a lot easier to find a solution. So potentially there was a problem as to how Americans have access to broadcast television or broadcast radio. Like we could work with members of the other party and say, because this hasn't become a partisan issue, like we can work together on this and find a solution. And that becomes much more easier when we get constituent mail where it's something that you can just take something like immigration. Like clearly millions and millions of Americans are very passionate about immigration reform or border security. The two parties have, for the most part, fairly distinct views on that issue. So it really becomes difficult for members to really, unless they've really staked out a position away from their party, it really becomes difficult for either Democrats or Republicans to take a position that's in opposition to the general sense of their party.
Got it. I'll tell you what really resonates with me on this, and that's how the constituent personalizes this email. The first few words after the salutation are I rely on my local radio and TV stations for critical news and weather. So immediately they're personalizing this issue and conveying to the congressman about how it impacts them, right? And it's my connection to the community. And when I was a legislative staffer, that's something that I knew would appeal to the congressman, because offices do get a lot of mail on a regular basis, and they're all important. But when constituents are able to clearly articulate how and why an issue is important to them, that helps that member of Congress be an even more effective advocate on their behalf, whether it's during a committee hearing or on the general floor of the House debating a bill. Okay, let's take a look at the next email that you shared with us. All right, so this email I'll read briefly for those, again, listening in via their phone. Dear Representative Green, I encourage you to visit our public charter school. As a public charter school supporter and your constituent, I'd like for you to witness firsthand why public schools are an important option for Texas families, including the 273,000 students that attend them and the 141,000 students waiting for public charter school seats. We are counting on you to represent the interests of the children and families in your district. Regards. So again, these letters were selected at random. But Sergio, what are some things in this email that kind of stand out to you as an effective or effectively written email?
Well, coming back to what you had mentioned, I do appreciate the fact that it's personalized. It's saying that it's really asking a member, in this case, of course, my boss, Congressman Green, to come visit a public charter school. It emphasized the point that these schools are public, and so, right, and then they're an important option for Texas families, which is true. They're an option for, if you're a parent and you're not satisfied with the local public school, this is another option that you can apply and see if or at least examine and look and see if your child can attend. And I guess more directly to Congressman Green, Congressman Green's very familiar with charter schools. If you're familiar with the KIPP schools, the KIPP academies, the first ones actually opened in his district 25 years ago. So he has a relationship with the people who started the KIPP academies, and so he's very on this issue. He's supportive of making sure that public charter schools have the resources they need to stay open to provide what's necessary for school children. Okay.
Now, one thing that jumps out to me in this particular letter is the use of statistics and figures. For you and for the congressman, setting aside this particular issue, how are numbers, in this case, like the 273,000 students and the other number, 141,000 students, how are numbers received for you all when you're receiving constituent mail? How important is that to include those stats and figures in correspondence?
Well, I think they're very valuable. It really gives context to the number of people, the number of children that we're talking about. Like when you bring up 141,000 students in Texas alone are waiting to attend a charter school, it's a potent argument. It's something that where you can't say, well, this doesn't apply to my constituents or my community. When you're talking about a number that large, it has to apply to every congressional district and every community.
Right. Gotcha. Well, that's helpful. Thank you. Next, I want to transition from email into the social media realm, particularly Facebook and Twitter. So on this slide, we see that Congress is on social media, and we have figures for the Senate, the House, and the executive branch and mayors on the municipal level. But for the House, we see that 100% of all House members are on Facebook. 96% of all House members are on Twitter. So Sergio, how does your office and how does Congressman Green handle social media communication from constituents? In this instance, via Facebook and Twitter?
So Congressman Green, I would say, is more of a newcomer to the mass use of social media in comparison to some of his younger and less senior colleagues. But we've been getting more active in social media the past 2 to 3 years, and so I think he's a proponent. He enjoys seeing positive response from things that he can post. So, if he has a meeting with a school group or an organization that comes to visit, and you can post it on Facebook or Twitter, and it gets 100, 200, or 300 likes. I mean, we see that as very beneficial. Or he's introducing a bill that we post on Facebook, we post on Twitter, that will help the district in some way. That seems very beneficial. Conversely, the congressman also appreciates hearing from constituents on social media. It is, in his eyes, like just another avenue to communicate with your electeds. And so it's if we were to receive a large number of hits on social media, either Facebook or Twitter, on a specific bill or policy area, we would absolutely bring it up to his attention if he didn't notice it already, and saying, this is of a growing concern. Clearly, there are many people that are concerned with, issue X or policy Y, and we would want to have some kind of response to these concerns.
Okay, excellent. And can you think of an example or two of campaigns that might have had a strong social media presence that really resonated with you and your staff? And if you can, off the top of your head, completely understandable, but I didn't know if anything came to your mind.
On social media, I would say
long about it.
Okay. No, because I mean, I would just, I would say, I guess the one that crossed my mind is, the issue of net neutrality. I think the proponents of net neutrality and internet broadband being classified as a Title II service, they have been very effective in their use of social media, both in communicating with the American public at large, and in communicating with elected officials and advocating for their position.
Okay, understood. Now I want to ask about your take and what might be beneficial for our listeners and those who are involved in advocacy as a profession. What are some suggestions that you can share with our listeners that they can incorporate into their grassroots advocacy and their public policy engagement? Because our listeners are professionals who work to engage either their members or their supporters to contact offices like yours to convey their policy positions and to urge Congress to take a stand on an issue. So what suggestions can you share with these professionals that they can then incorporate into their practice?
I think there's several things that could be done. I mean, simplest, and I believe that this is effective, is numbers. If we get 5 letters asking to co-sponsor a bill and we get 50 letters, I mean, Congressman Green would be more likely to want to co-sponsor a bill if he's gotten 50 letters or 100 letters saying, please co-sponsor a bill, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, bills that are not, that he's a Democrat, that a Democrat would not have like a political reason. There wouldn't be something political that would prohibit him or her from co-sponsoring that legislation. If we're in that kind of scenario, I think it's pretty likely that Congressman Green would either co-sponsor a bill or take it under like strong consideration. And I know he's far from the only member of Congress that would see in those eyes. I would also say
all members sorry to interrupt, but regardless, all constituents get a response, regardless of whether or not the congressman would co-sponsor or not, correct?
Absolutely. Like we will respond. And if for example, if we get like 30 or 40 letters on a bill and it says, please co-sponsor this bill, I'm going to bring it to the congressman's attention. And, if there's no like overarching policy or political reason to co-sponsor, like I'm pretty confident he would co-sponsor. He would write a letter saying like, thank you for writing, appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I'm now a co-sponsor of this bill. And we've done that on several occasions. I would say another effective tool, something that you had mentioned earlier in the conversation, is being able to personalize correspondence, either just by how it's written, by saying I, like making it personalized, or adding your own personal anecdote. I think even with congressional staff, when they're processing with his mail, and there's a personalized anecdote, in either a social media post or a letter or a phone call, we're going to respond to much more strongly than something that that's not as personalized. It makes it much more real. Makes it much more likely that this is not the only person in this district or this state that's being impacted, and we should not only respond but act to be able to help these people or help this person.
Right. That's helpful to know. I read an article where another senior staffer for a member of the House of Representatives made the comment that from the staffer's perspective, from the Hill office perspective, they can tell when people, like you said, personalize that, share their own kind of anecdote. And this staffer said, essentially, the more effort that our office feels that the constituent has put into writing this letter, the more they will try to tailor their response and really work to address the concerns. So they can really tell when somebody is really conveying directly how it affects them. Correct?
I would agree with that 100%. Like you can definitely tell when someone puts some thought into a message, even if it's a message that the Congress may not even necessarily agree with politically. But if it's well reasoned, like we're going to give like an appropriate response. Like we're not just going to send them some like ham-handed, perfunctory response. Because you have to respect for people's time, and and someone cares enough about something that it's only appropriate as their representative to get back with them in an appropriate manner.
Right. Thank you for that answer. Now I want to ask another question before going to questions that some of our listeners have submitted. We've covered, correspondence where it's clear that people have put in a lot of time and effort and personalized that correspondence. But going back to something that we talked about a little bit earlier, what happens when you all receive an influx of mails and calls on a particular issue? You mentioned numbers you mentioned are like 5 and 50, but sometimes groups and organizations have members that number in the hundreds, and in a few cases maybe thousands, but that might be hundreds per district. What happens when you have like 100 or so people, 200 people within your district writing to you on a particular issue, calling you about a particular issue, when the numbers are that high, right? How is that perceived? How is that received? Sometimes they might be more personalized. Sometimes they might be a standard form letter. Give us an overview about that increased volume and that's effect on your office.
I would say that would definitely catch all of our attention if we got a letter or letters and numbering in the hundreds, and that we would need to have a strong response. I can remember a few years ago, there was an organization that had it was a postcard campaign on a very small issue that the congressman did not really have a set policy on, a set view on. And we received, I think it was on the order of 200 postcards. And he said, well, we got to respond to this. And it basically asked them to contact some stakeholders and say, can you help out with this issue that's going on? And that's what he did. And as their elected representative, that's part of the gig, I guess you could say in so many words.
Right.
So I would
Right.
say when correspondents are in the large numbers, electeds are much more likely to be responsive.
Okay. Okay. Going back to social media briefly, we've talked about the numbers in the House for Facebook and Twitter. So one particular post and slide I want to share with you, 80% of offices interviewed said that between 1 to 30 posts on social media on an issue was enough to get their attention. I know it can vary from office to office, and all kinds of correspondence gets a response from Congressman Green. But I know some offices have a staffer that handles the social media correspondence. In some examples, members of Congress themselves respond to constituents and actively monitor their own profiles. If you're willing to share this with you, where does your office kind of fall and in which camp?
So our communications director monitors the social media accounts for the congressman.
Okay.
And he would be the primary person to remark to the congressman, we've noticed X amount of responses or X amount of posts on your Twitter account or your Facebook account. I also monitor the account. Our chief of staff also monitors the account. So we would also, check in, with a fair amount of regularity, what the status is. And if there's several responses on the same issue, like we will bring it to the congressman's attention.
Okay. It's encouraging to hear. And then 70% of offices agree that social media makes the representatives more accountable to their constituents. So, I know a lot of times social media can drive traffic and can bring more people into this conversation, people who may not be as directly impacted, but might be a friend or a neighbor or a relative within the district of a constituent who wrote to their elected official and decided to share that with their friends and family on social media. Do you kind of feel that there has been more of a, you've always been responsive, but do you feel that you all are playing on more fields now that you're doing emails and phone calls and social media and Twitter? It's like a bob and weave a little bit, right?
Honestly, I'm not sure if I've seen in those terms. It's just one more avenue for constituents to contact their elected officials.
Okay.
We've had emails, for 2 decades now. Of course, telephone and letters had always been, previous to that, always been a way that citizens, constituents have contacted their federal officials. So social media is just another thing, but we try to be as responsive as possible.
Okay. Excellent. So what I want to do now is turn to a couple of questions from our listeners. And I thank you all for submitting these questions. So one question is, what is the best way to reach a staffer for the first time regarding a policy issue? And they asked, is the best way by phone call, by email, by social media? And I'll provide some context to this before you answer, Sergio. We know, particularly on the House side, there are a lot of staff that handle the policy matters, legislative directors, legislative assistants, and they serve as advisors to members of Congress. When, the policy campaigns will write the actual office, but maybe some of our partners and their colleagues want to follow up with the office on that campaign. How can they best reach the office and staffers in the office?
I would say the best way, I think either way works, with either calling the office and asking for the staffer in question or asking to speak with the person that works on issue X, or if you can get their email to write to them via email, and just say, like, I would like to talk to you, or I'd like to set up a meeting so we can discuss, the issue, whatever the question is.
Okay, excellent. And then another question, if a constituent provides a leave behind packet after a meeting, so again, a lot of times organizations have that DC-based representation, and their DC policy staff will come and do Hill meetings. With these leave behind packets, do offices find that useful? And what kind of information that is in these leave behind packets is most helpful for the member and his or her staff?
So I do find the packets helpful. It depends on what the ask is.
Okay.
Personally, I like information that, first of all, just some explanation of what their question is, like a written explanation. Like if it's like, we want the congressman to co-sponsor a bill, it'd be helpful just having like a summary of that bill. And or just like explanation as to why their organization supports that bill. It's also helpful to have information of that, if it's a company or like an industry sector, it's helpful to have information as to like how that company or how that industry sector impacts a member's district or a member's state. So it gives it like context, like it's to say like these are reasons why, right? This company employs your constituents. You should, you want to be helpful. You want to, make sure that your constituents stay employed. In so many words.
Right.
So
right.
That's in all of our best interests. And I would say those, or if it's a letter, the request that we would like, the congressman to sign up to a letter, a copy of the letter is helpful, or a summary of the letter, just providing background. So I think those are the, at least when I look through the information, I usually find those to be the most helpful.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you for that. And as we wind down, I'll turn it over to you. Are there any final comments that you'd like to share with our listeners? You as somebody who's been on the Hill for several years now and has seen correspondence change. I mean, when I was on the Hill, there weren't as many members actively on Facebook and Twitter, right? That's different now. But you've seen those transitions and you've seen that evolution. So any final comments that you'd like to share with our listeners as to what they can continue doing to make sure that their correspondence is effective and their advocacy is effective?
I would say that there's a pretty, a lot of times I think advocates, or I shouldn't say a lot of times, I'd say sometimes there's advocacy that doesn't emphasize, doesn't touch on that local connection. And I think for many electeds, and for many staffers, that's a very important point. There is a large value to say, that X amount of people will be impacted by this policy or this legislation. It can equate to, improving people's health or improving the economy of that area, or improving, it could be educational outcome. And I think that's personally, I find that to be very persuasive. I know the congressman, and I believe most electeds, they find that a persuasive argument, because ultimately we're here to represent some geographic area, some communities. And when there's a disconnect as to I guess that very just like this literal definition of what it means to be a member of Congress, it becomes easier for an elected official to say, I can't support you on that, when it's disconnected from who sent him or her here.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. That leaves us with powerful words to depart on. So I want to thank everybody who joined us today for our webinar. Sergio Espinosa, I want to thank you especially for taking time today to speak with us and provide your take and your feedback as a senior staffer in terms of what is most effective, and for Congressman Green responding to his constituents in such an effective and consistent manner. We thank you all. As Leah mentioned, this webinar will be available online for future viewing and listening. So once again, thank you all very much for spending this near hour with us today. And we look forward to you all joining us on the next one.